All right, let's dive into some cosmic horror. Today we're looking at H.P. Lovecraft. And we've got kind of a fascinating question in front of us. Can Lovecraft's work, all this stuff with ancient beings and chilling tales, can it all really be considered a mythology?
Yeah, it's a question that's been around for decades. From scholars to fans, everybody's got an opinion. But to really break it down, I think we need to start with, what exactly makes something a mythology?
You're right, we need a starting point, and that's why I pulled this excerpt from Wikipedia. It's all about myth. And one thing that really stood out was how they define myth as a sacred narrative. It's not just any story, right? There's got to be something deeper there, some kind of connection to a culture's beliefs.
Right, exactly. And you often see these narratives centered around gods or demigods, or people with supernatural powers, like the Greek myths with Zeus and Hera, or Norse mythology with Odin and Thor. These figures, they embody certain values, and they try to make sense of the world around them.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's this idea about how stories change over time. Myths can become like folk tales, and historical events can get this mythological quality. They even use the example of King Arthur in the article.
Oh yeah, King Arthur and the Matter of Britain, that's the perfect example. You have Arthur, possibly a real warlord from way back in the 5th century and over centuries. He becomes this legendary king with knights and wizards and the Holy Grail. It's real world events turning into these mythic tales.
So how does all of this apply to Lovecraft? He invented this whole pantheon of cosmic entities,
Wow.
Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth. Do those guys even work as gods in his stories? They're powerful for sure, and they inspire awe, but are they sacred, like in the same way as Zeus or Odin?
That's the real question, isn't it? And I think how Lovecraft portrays them is key. Looking at the stories he picked out, you can definitely see a sense of reverence there, even worship surrounding these entities.
Oh, totally. Like in the Call of Cthulhu, that sculpture, the one the narrator describes. He says it looked like a giant squid or octopus, but it was more than just the shape. It was the overall feeling. It made him think of these awesome primal things. It's clear there's something creepy there, but also something captivating about them.
Right, exactly. And then you've got the cult, the one worshiping Cthulhu. They do rituals, they chant his name. It's similar to how ancient cultures would worship their gods, with ceremonies and prayers and stuff. But with Lovecraft, there's this twist. His gods are often malevolent or indifferent, or sometimes they're just completely incomprehensible.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so scary. It's not your typical good versus evil. It's more like existence versus utter cosmic indifference. Like we're ants, just scurrying around, completely insignificant to these massive ancient beings.
Exactly. He flips the whole idea of benevolent deities on its head. It's more about cosmic horror, the fear of the unknown, and how tiny and insignificant humans are compared to these vast cosmic forces.
And yet, even with this twist, I see these themes and motifs in his stories. They almost feel like he's building a mythos. You got these hidden ancient cities, like Arlia in the Call of Cthulhu, or the Nameless City. There's this sense of ancient history, just out of reach.
And don't forget about the forbidden knowledge and the dangerous texts, like the Necronomicon. It pops up again and again, this book of ultimate evil, full of secrets humanity was never meant to know.
Oh, right, the Necronomicon. It's like a dark version of sacred texts from other mythologies, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Greek Theogony. But instead of offering guidance or wisdom, this one leads to madness and destruction.
That's a great point. It really reinforces that idea that Lovecraft's drawing from traditional mythology, but he's twisting it, making something new and unsettling, familiar but fundamentally different.
I'm also noticing all these dreams and visions. It's like his characters are tapping into some hidden reality, a realm where all these cosmic entities live.
That's another element that lines up with mythology. You've got prophetic dreams in Greek mythology, shamanic visions in indigenous cultures. Dreams have always been seen as a gateway to other worlds, and Lovecraft uses that. But instead of divine guidance, these dreams show you terrifying glimpses of the true nature of the cosmos.
So even though Lovecraft might not have gods and goddesses in the traditional sense, he's created a framework that feels kind of similar to a mythology. There's a structured narrative, powerful entities, recurring motifs,
Yeah.
and a worldview that tries to explain the unknown, even if it's terrifying and bleak.
That's a really good point, and it brings up a fascinating question. Does the mythology have to have benevolent deities? Or can a system of belief built around cosmic dread and human insignificance, can that still function as a mythology?
Good question. And it makes me think about another piece of the puzzle. How did scholars in the past think about where myths came from? We've got this excerpt from Wikipedia about 19th century theories. And I gotta say, I found them pretty mind-blowing.
Let's talk about that. It's crucial to understanding how Lovecraft's work fits in with the broader context of mythology. Before we get to those 19th century theories, I think it's worth taking a minute to think about what we've already talked about. We've seen how Lovecraft's work, it has some similarities with these older mythologies, like the ancient cities, the forbidden texts, the dreams as portals. It seems like he's really trying to construct this whole system of belief, like a way to understand the cosmos.
Yeah, you're right. It's like he's built this alternate reality with its own rules and its own history and this whole hierarchy of beings. And yeah, it can be bleak and disturbing, but there's something about it that just draws you in.
Exactly, and that's what makes this debate about whether it's a mythology so interesting.
Yeah.
Because even though it doesn't have the usual gods and goddesses, the benevolent ones, it still taps into that basic human need for stories that explain the world.
It's like he's offering a different kind of mythology, one that fits with the anxieties of the modern age. Instead of gods who protect and guide you, you have these cosmic entities representing vastness, indifference, even the hostility of the universe.
Exactly. And now's a good time to bring up those 19th century theories about myth the Wikipedia article talks about. These scholars, Tyler and Miller, they had some pretty wild ideas about how myths came to be.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Miller thought that myth was basically a disease of language, like an illness.
Right.
He believed that in ancient languages, with no abstract nouns and no neuter genders. It led to people creating anthropomorphic figures of speech.
Right, so instead of saying something like, the sun is shining brightly, they might say, the sun god is smiling down on us.
And eventually those figures of speech, they became literal in people's minds. That's how they started believing in gods and goddesses controlling nature.
Exactly. And even though most scholars don't believe in nature mythology anymore, it's still cool to think about how language can change how we see the world.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if Lovecraft, with those really vivid and disturbing descriptions, if he was tapping into something like that too.
That's a great connection, because even though Lovecraft wasn't using ancient languages or anything, he was a master of language. He used words to create these images that really evoke dread and awe.
Like when he describes Cthulhu, the call of Cthulhu. He says it's a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. It's so grotesque and otherworldly, it's hard to even imagine.
And that's what makes it so effective. He uses language to create something that's both familiar and totally alien. It taps into those primal fears of the unknown.
And then there's Arlia, that sunken city where Cthulhu sleeps. It's described as this cyclopean, non-Euclidean nightmare of architecture, with angles and geometry that don't make sense.
It's like he's showing us the limits of human perception. Our minds just can't grasp the true nature of these ancient beings, or the realms they live in.
Which brings us back to the idea of forbidden knowledge. This is a theme that comes up all the time. The idea that there are truths about the universe that are too dangerous for humans to know. Like how reading the Necronomicon drives people crazy.
Exactly. That connects to a really old tradition in mythology and folklore, Pandora's box, the Tree of Knowledge. There's always this idea that if you seek knowledge beyond certain boundaries, bad things will happen.
So, in a way, Lovecraft is playing on those ancient anxieties about the limits of what we can know. He's saying that there are things out there that we should just leave alone, that curiosity can lead us down dangerous paths.
And it's not just about knowledge itself, it's about how that knowledge spreads. Like the Necronomicon, it's this symbol of how knowledge can be dangerous, even infectious.
Right, it's like this literary virus, spreading madness and chaos. And this fear of contagious knowledge, it's not unique to Lovecraft. Think about how many books have been banned because people were afraid of them.
Absolutely. This idea of forbidden knowledge, it's deep in our culture, and Lovecraft uses it to create this sense of dread and unease.
Okay, so we know Lovecraft borrows from mythology, and his use of language is key to the cosmic horror. But does his work actually function as a mythology?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think it comes down to this. Does Lovecraft's work give us a way to understand the universe, even if it's a terrifying and bleak one?
And does it resonate with readers the way traditional mythologies did?
Exactly. To answer those questions, I think we need to look at some specific examples from the stories you chose.
So we've covered a lot of ground. Talked about Lovecraft's inspiration from mythology, how he twists it to make cosmic horror, and how his language creates that feeling of dread.
Yeah, we've even touched on some pretty big ideas about what myth is and how it's changed over time, which brings us back to the main question. Is Lovecraft's work really a mythology?
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, his work is so different from traditional myths.
Yeah.
But the more we dig into it, the more I see those connections.
Me too. And one thing that makes me think it could be a mythology is the impact it's had on other creators, writers, artists, filmmakers, even musicians. They've taken his ideas and run with them, expanding on them, reinterpreting them.
It's like he planted a seed in our imagination, and it's grown into this whole thing, the Cthulhu mythos, a shared universe of stories and characters that's still evolving and inspiring new stuff.
Right, and that's a sign of a successful mythology. It's not static, it changes, it adapts, it gets reinterpreted with every generation. Think about the Greek myths. They've been retold so many times. Plays, poems, novels, movies, even video games.
Yeah, and each time they're retold, it adds a new layer of meaning to the original myths. So maybe Lovecraft's work is doing the same thing, becoming a kind of modern folklore, passed down and changed by each generation.
And just like those older mythologies, Lovecraft's work gives us a way to understand the universe. Even if it's kind of unsettling, his stories deal with these big questions: humanity's place in the cosmos, the limits of knowledge, good and evil. He doesn't give easy answers, but he makes you think about these things.
I think that's why people still connect with his work. Even though it was written almost 100 years ago, he taps into those primal fears. Fear of the unknown, fear of being insignificant, fear of things we can't control.
Exactly. And in a world that feels so chaotic, there's something comforting about a mythology that acknowledges those fears, that gives them a name and a face, even if it's a horrifying, tentacled monster from space.
It's like he's saying, yeah, the universe is terrifying, and we're just tiny creatures, but at least we're all in this together.
And maybe there's comfort in that shared experience of dread.
Maybe so. So where does that leave us? Have we answered the question about whether Lovecraft created a mythology?
I think it's up to each person to decide. There's no single right answer. But we've seen some pretty strong evidence that Lovecraft's work is like a mythology. It gives us a way to see the universe, it tackles big questions, and it keeps inspiring new creators.
And maybe that's the most important part. It's not about fitting into some definition. It's about the impact the work has, the conversations it starts, and how it connects with people.
Exactly. So I'd say, check out Lovecraft's stories. See what you think. What scares you? What makes you question everything?
And who knows? You might discover a whole new way of understanding mythology and storytelling. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of H.P. Lovecraft. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.